Hello everyone, today I'll be talking about Klaus Doldinger and Giorgio Moroder's score for The NeverEnding Story. Now, although I've seen this film many times, because Giorgio Moroder's name was attached, I had always assumed that he was the lead composer. But this is completely incorrect. See, Klaus Doldinger initially scored the entire film for the original German release. It was only when the film was going to be released internationally, and particularly in America, was Moroder brought in to rescore a few scenes and add some additional cues. Apparently this was done in order to create film music in a film that resonated more with American children. And once you know this, the difference in their two parts of the score becomes quite apparent. See, Doldinger, his score has much more of a symphonic orchestral core with an electronic sheen over top. This gives it a somewhat more natural sound, although one still firmly dated in the 80s. And what's really kind of astounding about his score, which still makes up the majority of the American version, is the amount of themes that he's able to put in. And not just number, but really strong, distinct themes that all are quite memorable and bring up a strong emotional resonance. For instance, the most well-known and the most apparent of these, in my opinion, is what can be called the flying theme, which appears throughout the film when any character is flying on the back of the luck dragon Falcor. This is really a soaring, majestic theme that really triggers and shows the wonderment and the joy that these characters feel when riding on the back of this luck dragon. Another really strong theme is either the Atreyu theme or the Orin theme with this magical amulet. It's hard to discern exactly which aspect it belongs to because the character and the item are so closely linked. But this is much more sober, regal sound that gives a level of import to Atreyu's quest to save Fantasia and to preserve and save the imagination of all human children. These are two of my favorite, but Doldinger has maybe half a dozen very strong themes that appear throughout the film. And he even has a couple motifs or cues that, while they don't particularly appear throughout, they're so strong that they become immediately intertwined with the scene itself. So for instance, when Atreyu visits the Southern Oracle, you have this really heavy, dark theme that channels the awe and the fear that Atreyu feels. And you only hear it maybe throughout a few minutes of the scene, but it's so distinct and so prevalent that it will always stick in your mind. Moroder, on the other hand, really leans into the electronics, and he even uses some electric guitar, which the more it's used, the more it sounds out of place. But this doesn't mean that his aspect of the score is inferior, because he also has two incredibly memorable themes as well. The first of these can be called the Sorrow theme. It's this slow, trudging synth horn that, because of its slow pace, seems like it's about to stop and give up at any moment, and it really channels the kind of pressure that Atreyu feels and his conflict inside of just wanting to give up throughout because his quest is so difficult. The other can be called the Ivory Tower theme, which is just this bombastic, awe-filled theme that really shows how just inspiring and almost unbelievable the vision of the Ivory Tower is, both when we see it early on as this kind of glowing bastion of salvation, but also much later in the film when the nothing has taken over much of Fantasia, and we again finally see the Ivory Tower, and it seems like the only thing left in the world, and it gives one last glimmer of hope. But fortunately, Moroder's themes are used in much smaller snippets than what's available on release, because for whatever reason, he, in the actual physical release, has these melodies come in quite early on in his tracks, and then he builds on them with additional layers of electronics and, as I mentioned, electric guitar, and it really muddies the sound, and it takes away from the power of these themes. So fortunately, the melodies in their more simple, basic, stripped-down form are used in the film, making them much more effective. But this is also quite a frustrating score, and particularly its release in America and internationally, because there are two releases. Doldinger has a release that's, I think, 17 tracks, and it's roughly the entirety of his score. And then there's a separate, more easily obtainable release that features, I believe, 6 tracks of Moroder's, including the title song, and another, I think, 9 tracks of Doldinger. The problem is that these tracks of Doldinger are abridged versions. So I think there's a track about the one of the main antagonists, Gomorrah. And in the American release, it's maybe a minute, maybe less. And yet in the German release, this track is 3.5 minutes. So you have Doldinger's portions just butchered. But it's also a hard score to listen to on the release because rather than forming a narrative or putting the tracks chronologically so you can kind of follow along with the film, it's Giorgio Moroder's tracks are put first, and then Doldinger's tracks follow. And so it's a really jarring experience that has very little flow. It was a very strange choice, making this ripe for re-release. One other wrinkle is that the enjoyment of this score may very well rely upon nostalgia. See, I first watched this film over 20 years ago, and it's always been one of my favorites, and it's always stuck with me. And so when I hear one of these themes, no matter how rooted in the mid-'80s it might be, it triggers all of these memories. If I hear the sorrow theme, I immediately think about what happens in the film and the emotional resonance that that track has. But someone coming into the score fresh, or the film fresh, having no predisposition towards it, may find it too rooted in the past to really enjoy. Obviously, some of the synths don't hold up compared to modern synths and modern instruments, but it's a product of its time. Every piece of music is. And so if you're new to the score, hopefully these snippets that I've shown have been interesting enough for you and haven't felt too dated or cheesy, because it is a wonderful score and it is a truly wonderful film. So take some time, watch the film, and listen to the score, because it is truly one of the great fantasy films and one of the great fantasy scores.